at this time, I do want to consider the biological, physiological nature of Christ. Christ was born into real sinful flesh, and I want us to glean this from two scriptures, both in Romans, one in Romans chapter 1, and the second in Romans chapter 8. Romans 1, in reference to Jesus Christ, it says that he was born of the seed of David according to the flesh. And in Romans 8, the same truth is illustrated in verse 3, where it says what the law could not do, and that it was weak through the flesh, God did, sending his own Son in the likeness of sinful flesh, and as an offering for sin, he condemned sin in the flesh. So it's clear from these texts that Christ did have a real and true sinful nature. Now some would claim, if we were to proclaim this, that we are calling Christ a sinner. But this comes from a faulty predisposition to believe that your physical nature constitutes sin. Okay? And your degraded biological heredity constitutes sin. The reason this is false, and we can know that it's false, is from Romans 7, where Paul says that the law is spiritual, holy, good, and therefore the law's demands are on the heart, on goodness, on justice, on holiness, and spirituality, and not it's on the conditions of the heart and mind, and not on the body. Okay, so I want us to look at the implications of sinful flesh. In other words, what does it mean to have sinful flesh or a sinful nature? Because it's not the same as a carnal nature. The weakness of the physical nature includes all of the sorrow, struggle, and weariness of the human nature. And as well as the weakness, it must be understood that Christ had biological pulls towards sin. And this brings me to my next point, that Christ was tempted in all points like we are, but I want to take just a short moment to deal with this text. Hebrews chapter 4 verse 15 says, "For we do not have a high priest who cannot be touched with the feelings of our weaknesses, but was tempted in all things as are we, yet without sin." And I think just from talking with people that a lot of people have this text misunderstood, because they associate this to mean that Christ was carnal, that he had a carnal nature. And that you don't have to be carnal to be tempted, and it doesn't mean that the temptations were the same. Okay, so the way I will attempt to illustrate this, and we know that illustrations are imperfect, there are plenty of people in this world who have been tempted to grab a dangerous weapon and inflict physical pain on someone. Okay, they've actually been tempted to do that. All right. Now, we know that that constitutes the temptation of the commandment that says what?
Thou shalt not kill.
Thou shalt not kill. Okay. Now, I'm sure I can safely say that in this school and in this class, most of us probably haven't been tempted to grab a dangerous weapon and actually murder somebody. But I can say that we've all been tempted to be angry at our brother without a cause. Okay? So in that, we see that the temptation is still there for the principle of the law. But it doesn't mean that Christ had to be tempted to grab a machete and go and stab someone. It's not necessary for him to have experienced that in order for him to be tempted in all points as we were. The temptation from wanting to do that, murdering someone or stabbing someone, it comes from a developed carnal nature. And we're going to deal briefly with what that is. But to be tempted in all points as we are, the law's foundation is love towards God and love towards man. And so those are the central points of all of our temptation. Christ didn't necessarily have to have been tempted to commit fornication. But that doesn't mean that his biology didn't crave in some way a relationship with a woman. I'm not talking about a sexual relationship, just a relationship. A lot of people feel like they have to go to the extreme, and I've heard it presented, that Christ was tempted to fornicate. Okay, I don't think that's necessary, but it doesn't change the fact that Christ was still tempted in the same points of the law as we were. All right? And the concluding point that I'm making is that it is not necessary. You do not have to be carnal to be tempted. Which brings us to our final point, that Christ did not have a carnal nature. He was tempted from the sinful nature. Each and every one of us has developed from the moment we are born, we're born into a slavery to the impulses of our body. Okay, and I'm sure we've all experienced this as unconverted. Some no doubt worse than others. But there is, for every person who's born into the world, a degree of natural slavery to the impulses, which is ultimately selfishness. There's two definitions for carnality, and I'm speaking about it in a general sense. The first is in Romans chapter 7, verse 14, where Paul says, "We know that the law is spiritual, but I am carnal, sold under sin." So we see here that there's a contrast to spirituality of the law, which is self-sacrificing love. But Paul says that I'm carnal, sold under sin. Or in other words, sold into slavery to sin. I'm in bondage to sin, is what he's saying, which is selfishness. So what happens is, we're born with pulls, okay? First of all, we're born with a disconnect to God. And we have biological pulls. Christ had the very same pulls to sin. But the only difference is, because of our disconnection with God, those pulls take us with it. The impulses of sin take our minds with it. Whether it could be subtle pride and selfishness, or it could be murder and etc., etc. Okay? Now the second says that the carnal mind is enmity against God, for it is not subject to the law of God, neither indeed can be. So one principle of being carnal is that you have the law of God here, and it's a standard and it has requirements, and Paul is saying that the carnal mind cannot be subject to the law of God. It's not even able to do it. The reality is that we have to be converted. The heart has to be transformed. In Desire of Ages, Ellen White says that keeping the law is not what is going to save us. All that's going to do is produce a mere legalistic religion. What she says is that the Christian needs a transformation of nature. She's not talking about this nature, biological nature. She's talking about the nature of selfishness that resides in the heart. So the carnal mind, or being carnal, involves a disconnection from God's Spirit and being enslaved to the impulses of the lower nature. We are all born into this condition, as I will read a statement from the Spirit of Prophecy. Ellen White says, "One of the most deplorable effects of the original apostasy was the loss of man's power of self-control. Only as this power is regained can there be real progress. The body is the only medium through which the mind and the soul are developed for the upbuilding of character. Hence it is that the adversary of souls directs his temptations to the enfeebling and degrading of the physical powers. His success here means the surrender to evil of the whole being. The tendencies of our physical nature, unless under the dominion of a higher power, will surely work ruin and death." Okay? That's really powerful. I want us to go through that again. The tendencies of our physical nature, not spiritual nature, not the nature of our heart, not the nature of our mind, the tendencies of our physical nature, unless under the dominion of a higher power, will surely work